preferred excuse me. We've shared a preferred site that was we shared with members who have registered and the public. It's on our website. Today, what I want to make sure that we have time to talk through is how we've gotten from the area of interest, the broader blob, the narrowed area, and the preferred site. But so that's what we'll spend time today talking about how we got here. Next slide. So early on, we set some initial siting criteria that you may have seen before, identifying that this ultimate lease application area will be 16 square miles. The project will be 12 turbines or fewer. And we identified an area of 20 to 40 miles offshore. The 40 miles was for, from a cost standpoint, for a project of this size, what made sense from a cost and technical standpoint. And then the 20 miles was to avoid nearshore waters that are important for fisheries and recreation and other uses. And so that's how we got into that blob that you see there. We also have identified 2 potential interconnection points, Wiscasset and Maine Yankee and Wyman Station in Yarmouth, which the decision related to cable route and interconnection point will not be made at this point, will be made later in the process. And then we had a preference for gravel and mud to allow for easier anchoring, although there's ways to anchor in other types of bottom, but those are the areas that we wanted to emphasize would be easiest. And then from a siting priorities, want to minimize conflicts with fishing and avoid high trafficked areas and limit visibility from shore. Next slide. And that's the area of interest, which is several hundred square miles. There are some known constraints from the very beginning that we were aware of, and that's what we've been working towards narrowing down since we released this information. Next slide. So right now we'll walk through in a bit of the information work that we've done. I'll start with the on navigation and defense, what we've learned through our process here. So on the defense side, you can see the DoD exclusion area that's in the red Y in the map. And that is an area that the DoD has identified as not compatible with offshore wind projects. In further conversations with the Department of Defense, there are other activities that in ways that this area is used for DoD activities, which is common across many areas of the nation's coastline. So it's not unique to the Gulf of Maine. The area to the west, the western portion of the area of interest is of greater use and importance to the DoD as compared to the eastern side. So the narrowed area, given its size and that it's in the eastern portion, is workable according to our conversations with the DoD, although they'll have a formal, as will all federal agencies, a formal consultation with BOEM when BOEM reviews the application. On the Coast Guard and the navigational front, we were aware when we developed the area of interest that it did include 2 transit separation schemes or shipping lanes. Those are the purple lines coming out of Portland that you see there, the eastern approach, and that as well. And so that area, we knew that we would not want to put the project in the shipping lane. Through our conversations with the Coast Guard, also learned that there's guidance recommending that the areas that are 2 miles off the side and 5 miles off the end of the shipping lane are avoided from to minimize conflict with navigation. So that's when you see the transit buffer there. That is guidance from the Coast Guard on the Atlantic coast. And so those are some considerations that we've taken into account with the narrowed area that you see here. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Carl to speak cover the work on the fisheries side.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Laura, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? All right. Great. Okay. Looks good. So thank you. My name's Carl Wilson. I work for the Department of Marine Resources, and I direct our Bureau of Marine Sciences. And And I was one of several members of the DMR that got pulled into these conversations relatively early on, and were kind of tasked with the objective of trying to understand what the fisheries footprints is within the large area, and also get a greater understanding of what the marine resources are that are out there. Next slide, please. Okay, so before I get go into our kind of assessment process and how we came to a narrowed area of interest, I just want to, acknowledge my partners and colleagues within the Department of Marine Resources. It was just an extraordinary team that we were able to assemble on a very short amount of time, and it was one of the more rewarding collaborations within the department that I've had over my 22 years of service for the state. And so those that have worked on this, they know their names, and I just want to very much appreciate and acknowledge that. So by bringing this team together, what we tried to do right from the start was gather as much data as we could. And so this came in the form of existing constraints, which Selena just talked about, and various commercial and recreational fisheries that were present. Now, some of these fisheries had very high resolution vessel monitoring systems on the vessels, and that gave us a very, kind of precise idea of where the activity was. Other fisheries like lobster or recreational fishing or tuna do not have vessel tracking devices, do not have reporting requirements that require the specificity that would be used as we started to assess what the footprint was. And that really made us go deep into our conversations with the fishing industry on what is a very controversial subject. And so I won't go too much into that detail, other than I'll describe it a little bit as we go into the into our combined fishing intensity. But again, our goal was to come up with this intensity of use and ultimately recommend a narrowed area of interest. We also considered marine mammals and kind of federal management structure. What's the greater context that the siting and these conversations are taking place? And then a really hard look into the bathymetry of the area. We got really lucky, and we were able to gain access to some early NOAA bathymetric data that really helped move our siting process and conversations along considerably. So I will say that, with the available data, you take one look at it and it leads you one way. The new data has provided that context. And so a little window into some of the new data that we think is a contribution within this process is what I'll talk about next. So next slide, please. And so this is a little window into how we conducted fisheries analysis through this process. And we did it through an interview process and combining with existing data. And so this was really an attempt to get a deeper understanding of the fishing activity. I believe back in December, we attempted to send out a broad initial survey after our first meeting that this group had together publicly. And we had some initial success that allowed us to springboard and identify several fishermen that were not happy to talk to us, but were willing to talk to us. And that allowed kind of an iterative process as we worked through different fisheries and different use and trying to just deepen our understanding of this area. We tried to cover all areas within the broad area of interest. And the image to the right, the map on the right, shows that as we conducted an interview, we interpreted that interview through a 1 arc minute grid, this grid that you see on the screen. And we interpreted the intensity of use for each fishery. This figure is actually the numbers of interviews that were scored for each of those grids. So if you see in Platts Bank, kind of, which is the anchor to this entire area, you'll see that's where the highest number of interviews were conducted, where areas to the west of Platts Bank or to the far eastern side of this area of interest, we had relatively few number of interviews as well. So it gives you a context of where the data density of our interviews took us. And again, we tried to cover all areas, and we tried to fill in as many holes as we could through our process. Next slide, please. So in order for us to generate the combined fishing intensity, essentially we took the average of score for each grid for each fishery, and then averaged across all fisheries. And so in our mind, what we were trying to do was to give an overall representation of what the intensity of use within the large area of interest is. And you know, this particular choice of a color ramp doesn't really emphasize as much as it came out through our interview process, just the importance of Platts Bank, which is kind of in the lower center portion of this map, as well as areas to the north of the large area, whether it be the Mistaken Ground, south of Daggett Ridge, Toothaker Ridge to the east, and Jeffries to the west as well. And so again, the richness of the interviews kind of brought out the areas with the highest intensity. It also identified areas that had relatively low or lower intensity of fishing. All areas had some sort of fishing at some point during the recent past. But the area that's in yellow in this map is what we are scoring as a relatively lower intensity of fishing. Next slide, please. So Selena introduced the narrowed area of interest earlier, and this is that narrowed area based on our fishing intensity. And what we tried to do was we took the sighting criteria that Selena introduced earlier, that not only distance from shore, but also potential habitats. And then we kind of cross-referenced that with our fishing intensity, and we came up with this revised area or narrowed area of interest that's outlined in purple here. So this area does not eliminate impact. There is fishing activity. There is active fishing activity in this area. Generally speaking, it's higher activity in the northern part of the narrowed area of interest than in the southern. But there is activity. Some of the features of this, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, but lend it to a particular type of fishing, and this might likely have the highest impact around groundfish vessels targeting species in greater than 90 fathoms, such as dabs, monkfish, and witch flounder. So this is a relatively flat mud bottom, and so you would expect the fishing activity would follow the species that inhabited those areas. Next slide, please. So if we dig a little deeper into the characteristics of the narrowed area of interest, what we suggested was a 54 square mile, that's statute miles, or 41 nautical square miles, or 34,000 acres. So the area is generally characterized as being between 90 and 100 fathoms of depth. Everything that, whether it be the data that we looked at or the conversations that we had about this area, it's soft sediments with a few bedrock outcroppings. The in-fauna community is likely going to be dominated by worms. This is probably a pretty high water content mud. And so species such as worms like to live there. Larger fauna such as flatfish, dabs, gray sole, monkfish are going to be certainly some of the highest valued commercial fish that may be caught in this area, but it also represents fish that, could be found in these habitats as well. And to me, one overarching point around the large area of interest, or this narrowed area of interest, is that I think it's very safe to say that this is kind of a transition between inshore fishing and offshore fishing, whether it be, and that means different things for different species and different fisheries. But for example, for lobsters, if as the fishery moves off, you start to lose some of the representation, meaning the numbers of fishermen, and you're transitioning into a pretty highly mobile fishery at that point, where some of the groundfish activity is almost just starting at this and picking up, and it has those connections, to areas outside. And so again, it's this transition that was overall just carried throughout the theme, and species have these connectivities between inshore areas as well as offshore areas as well. When we tried to pull some of the available economic data through the NOAA Footprints program, as well as the Federal Trawl Survey data, when we start talking about the narrowed area of interest, I think we are starting to exceed the resolution of those particular data sets, and that you start to get results that, as you query the available economic data, some suggested results that to us didn't make sense based on our knowledge of the area that we had accumulated. And so it's really at this point, I think this is kind of our major area of understanding. So next slide, please. So if we just kind of look at the conclusions around the narrowed area of interest, so context matters. The narrow area obviously has some constraints, as Selena talked about, whether it be the shipping channels or the DoD, Department of Defense wind exclusion areas. But then immediately to the south is this hatched area in green that is potentially proposed closure for the lobster fishery relative to upcoming right whale rules. And so it's a busy area in many ways. So within the large area, all areas have fishing activity. We tried to minimize the conflict within the criteria that we had for development. If you look at the preferred anchoring and habitat impacts, that does impact different species, and it does potentially impact different gear types as well, as far as fishing activity. And specifically trawl gear is going to have a potentially very different interaction with these structures as opposed to say a fixed gear such as a lobster trap. Not to say that lobsters won't be impacted, it just is going to be different. And then finally, and I think Wing will be talking about this, there does seem to be this synergy between wildlife and fisheries, in that it's a kind of a convergence down into this area that it kind of links human use patterns with the ecological patterns out there as well. And that kind of brings, at least within the department, brings us full circle back into questions around the ecosystem impacts of what development in this area might look like, as well as the fisheries impact as well. So I believe that is the end of my slides.
Great, Carl, thank you. Let's take some questions. So Carl, first there's a few in chat I just want to cover. Remind folks you can raise your hand, and if you are on the phone, you can hit *9, and that will raise your hand actually there as well. So there's two questions that are actually related. One is from Kenneth Capron. Will you be doing more interviews? What percentage of fishermen did you interview? And what percent of the catch did you interview? And then the question's kind of similar from Dustin, which is, if you didn't interview everybody who fishes in that area, you're going to have missing data, and it's possible there are folks fishing in the yellow area who you just didn't interview. So it's not a lack of fishing, it's a lack of an interview. So can you kind of speak a little bit to the methodology?
Well, again, this past winter, the context of being within the pandemic really limited some of the work that, traditionally, I think the department prides itself on is getting, sitting at the kitchen table and trying to work through some of these issues and working with small groups. And this is also an extremely difficult and controversial subject. So we tried to reach out as best we could. We tried to engage through webinars, through zone council meetings, through surveys, through word of mouth. And we did the best we could given the time constraints ahead. I do not know how many or what percentage of fishermen we were able to interview that are in this river, in the narrowed area. And I think, again, this is step one. And I know the department is committed to continuing to learn and understand about this area moving forward. And so I think there are opinions and knowledge that is yet to be expressed. And I'm hoping that we can continue to be receptive to that knowledge base.
Thank you, Carl. I'm going to go to Jeff and then to Terry. So Jeff, you're up first.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep, sound good.
Yep. Thank you. Carl, thanks for the presentation. I have a couple questions. I hope they're quick, but I want to begin by thanking you and the work that you and your team did on this, as well as Selena's, to get the information together that you presented here. I know there's been questions about the number of interviews, and I'm also well aware there was a lot of reluctance on behalf of a lot of people to participate in the interview process. And I just really appreciate the work that you and your team did to try to reach out to meet people on their own turf, so to speak, and to get the information that you've had. I'm sure you'll do more, but I just appreciate the work that all of you did to get us to this point. The first question I had was on the recreational layer. You said recreational tuna. Is the recreational layer is it a tuna layer? Because I know there's a lot of commercial tuna fishing as well as recreational. So I just wanted to know if recreational equals tuna.
It does, for kind of visual representation, Jeff. We did reach out to recreational fishing groups and individuals, as well as individual tuna fishermen. The use harpooners for tuna, we heard loud and clear, value this entire area as a prime tuna area. For non-harpoon tuna fishermen, the interviews and the characterization very much followed what we were learning from recreational fishermen, as far as the importance of Platts Bank, the importance of the mistaken ground, the importance of structure. And so that's why we combined recreational fishing and tuna, non-harpoon tuna.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And then on the groundfish information, I mean, the area of interest, as you said, is going to have impact on mobile groundfish fishermen. I know in the course of some of the interviews, in the course of the analysis, you were looking at some of the data on the NROC portal, I think, and there was sort of a nearer term time window that might have been the last 4 years. And then I know there was some suggestions to look further back on that, and you might get a slightly different picture of where and what is important out there. Can you just remind me or let me know, did you look at the nearer term window on the groundfish data, or did you look further back when you were doing your analysis on the commercial groundfish fisheries?
So when it came to actually scoring the VMS maps that you're referring to for our fishing intensity, we used the 2011 to 2014 time period, as was suggested. And from our perspective, that earlier time period did give a much richer context to the activity in the area. Yeah, so that's what we did.
All right. Thank you, Carl.
Terry, over to you. Sorry about that. I was on mute there. Then Ben.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Matt. Carl, so question. the economics that you're gonna be looking at with NOAA. So I'm just gonna lay out an example of what they used in southern New England, when they cited a couple of places down there. The economic data that they used was not that great, because if you look at it, I fish down there squid in the summertime. In the year that they looked at, if those places were actually, if those numbers are correct, I would have had 10% of the income in southern New England. Just me personally, with my boat in a couple hours, in a couple months. So we want to bear that in mind as we're looking at that.
I completely agree with you. I think when we get to an area like the as small as the narrowed area of interest, I'm highly suspect of the available economic data that we have. If you look at a fishery, for the large area, I'm trying to remember, pull this off the top of my head, but I believe 4 states and 26 ports were represented in the large area. And when we got to the small area and we were talking to fishermen that have activity and knowledge of those areas, their ports and states were not being represented in the economic data that was coming back. And so we have a hole there that we need to fill. I'd also say that not all federal fisheries have to report, this. And so the lobster landings that is available through the footprint program is, I believe, for the large area. And we did some gross estimations around the value of the lobster fishery based on distance from shore and the lobster zones and our 10% harvester reporting, which granted is a snapshot as well. But we're orders of magnitude different. And so again, that's a hole, that needs to be filled between the available data and actually what's going on there. And that's to Dustin's message within the chat as well, is that's where the more richness that we can understand of what's going on, now that we're talking about the narrowed area, or as Selena introduced, a preferred area, like we got to get down the brass tacks and start to understand, deeper into this. We've come a long way, but we've got more to go. So
Can I follow up, Pat?
Yep, Kerry, let's do it.
But yeah, so that's good. I'm glad that you're going to be looking at that, because as a member of the take reduction team, I was on the economic when this proposed rule came out, and we were commenting. They, according to the NOAA data, there was only $350,000 worth of economic impact in that green hashtag area offshore, and I think DMR come up with like 22 million. Right? Am I right?
Yeah, the order of magnitude differences sound about familiar. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kerry. Ben, over to you.
Thanks. I got 2 quick questions. And so, Carl, the first one is it's probably a moot point, but so because Platts was in this area, and this is a fairly heavily fished area, if you were to have expanded this potential site for analysis to encompass more of the coast, like would we just in how you did the analysis with hotspot analysis, would we be seeing different types of areas flaring up for potentially good sighting? You probably haven't looked very deeply into that data, but I guess I'm just concerned with like this narrowed focus on a already heavily fished area, if we may be seeing some inaccurate trends for impact to the fishing fleet. Do you understand kind of where I'm going with that?
Well, I mean, so the department was operating within constraints.
Yeah.
And, we were not in the business of trying to get outside of those constraints. So I think it'd be a speculative conversation. I do think that I personally really liked the approach that we took by trying to quantify the fishing intensity across multiple fisheries. I actually think this is a contribution in that you really start to knit the uses together and you start to get a little finer finer understanding, it's not just the space, there's a time continuum, there's a connection into and out of that area. And I can't imagine that doesn't occur along the entire coast or within the entire Gulf of Maine. There's deep knowledge and deep use of the fishing community of these areas.
Yeah. And then the second question is like, this is a heavily fished area, even the areas that aren't, that are kind of in the lighter colored. But I guess the question is like, so this is a research project. What type of baseline data exist for us to start building like change within these areas, and understanding that moving forward? And is that where some of that like $3 million is going to be spent in terms of surveying the area in times of year when the surveys don't normally take place? Or there's just in what you showed us the other day in terms of what exists even just for bathymetry, like there's not a lot of surveys in this area year round. There doesn't seem to be a lot of information about what's in the water without the fishing fleet weighing in. So I'm wondering what kind of baseline you guys think you have to understand change over time within these areas.
I think when you get down to the narrowed area, as I commented around the trawl survey, I think it's below the resolution of the federal trawl survey. So, objective number one is to get our trawl survey out there and start that, higher resolution baseline data. Objective number two is to understand deeper into what's going on with the fisheries as well. This, we now have an area to really start talking about. I'm not going to speak to the budget of that funds that is now available, but certainly it's high on our priority list is to start that baseline. We need, but it's not just trawl survey. We need tagging surveys. We need to understand the oceanographic conditions in that. We need to understand species moving in and moving out, etc. So,
maybe just because of time, I'm going to go. Ben, any follow up? Ben, all set? Okay. Let me take another question or two in the chat. I just need one only because of time, if we may get to everything. So one, I think there's a question about other states fishing this area, right, Carl? So did you capture other states' data as well, other states fishing in this area as well as Maine's?
We tried as best we could. It definitely, from our understanding, the further east you go, the more likely it is to be Maine boats. There was definitely some other state activity to the area west of Platts Bank, what's called the Wilkinson Toe. And that, from what we know or what we understand, is that's and Terry Alexander could speak to this, but it's kind of a setup area for Wilkinson Basin and fishing to the south. And so that's, heavily fished by a lot of different states at that point.
Right. And then Jeff just asked the question, does the Maine Inshore Trawl Survey sample in the refined area of interest at this point?
It does not. We end at about 12 miles, but we've been talking internally about what it would take to get our vessel back out to that. It's certainly doable.
Okay. And again, I think to emphasize the point you said, but I'll just go back to Kim's last question here is, are there not areas where wind and fishing do not overlay each other? And I think, in other words, I think there's no area within this area of interest broadly that doesn't have some kind of fishing activity. So it's a matter of relative intensity. It's not that there isn't a space with none.
Correct. We found fishing in through our interviews and the available data in the entire large area.
Great, thanks. Carl, thank you. Thanks for the good questions. Only in the spirit of time, we're going to move on, but we'll continue to have questions as we go throughout.
Yeah.
So I think what we'd like to turn to, oops, there's a question. Just Kenneth asked about outside of the area of interest. It's probably the Ben's question. And I think, Carl, you really, your focus was on what we'll call the football, right? And that's where you did your analysis, because that was what the constraints that was required of the state. So is that correct?
Yes,
okay.
That's correct. And there, clearly is kind of ecological fishing. There's connectivity in and out of that area. But no, we did not try to characterize outside of the area.
And so we'll note that. So Carl, thank you. Thanks for the good questions. I want to move kind of to the wildlife story. So I'm going to turn over to John Perry from Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and for Wayne Goodall from BRI to kind of help us with the next piece around wildlife. We'll get take some questions there, and then to get to hone in on the kind of narrative of interest to have some further conversation. So over to you, John and Wayne.
Thank you, Pat. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound good.
Great. My name is John Perry. I'm the Environmental Review Coordinator with the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. I'm actually replacing Amanda Cross, who was the leader for our agency, who recently accepted a position with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I'll be taking the lead from here on out and wish her well. Next slide, please. Maybe.
Cam, next slide there, if you could. There we go. I think we have
Great, thanks. Yeah, so the Gulf of Maine is pretty complex from a wildlife perspective. So just by way of quick overview, the Gulf hosts a diverse list of over 300 species. And of this group, there are around 292 species of birds that use the Gulf of Maine for some component of their life history requirement. These primarily include dozens of species of seabirds, species like your gulls, your terns, puffins, and petrels, as well as tens of thousands of sea ducks like eiders and scoters, which migrate through the Gulf of Maine as they make their way down the east coast to their respective wintering areas. We also have dozens of species of shorebirds, such as sandpipers, plovers, and knots, which refuel in Maine's mudflats and then begin their southward migration. Some of them heading out over the Gulf waters. And of course, with that group, we also have the thousands of songbirds which follow the coastline during the annual migrations. And we also have an assortment of other bird species, such as loons and herons and some species of falcons, which also migrate over our coast and bring them out into the Gulf of Maine waters, depending on their migration track. But it's not just the birds out there. In addition to the birds, we also have some data on the 8 species of bats that utilize the Gulf of Maine area. And much of our information on bats is limited to nearshore. However, some research conducted by Stantec Consultant of Maine has documented the presence of 3 of our migratory tree bats, as well as all 3 of our Myotis species of bats offshore, some of them with an average distance of around 37 miles from shore, and in the case of an eastern red bat, as far out as 81 miles from shore. And so not surprisingly, most of our information comes from studies of nearshore species and not from offshore surveys. And of course, a big reason for this is due to the vastness of the Gulf of Maine, making offshore population information much more difficult to acquire. We do have some limited survey data from out in the Gulf that has resulted in lots of total bird counts, but overall, however, there just are no comprehensive Gulf of Maine-wide distribution surveys for all species. Next slide, please. And so, as was mentioned in the introduction, over the past several months, the Governor's Energy Office, DMR, and Inland Fisheries and Wildlife have met with state and federal agencies and stakeholders in a series of webinars and work sessions. And through these meetings, stakeholders identified around 20 data sets that had the potential of being applicable to help us get a better handle of the research done to date in the Gulf of Maine. However, many of the data sets were not directly applicable for a variety of reasons, such as, for example, some of them lacked the data applicable to offshore wind, or they lacked the appropriate spatial information, or some of them simply just didn't overlap with the state's area of interest. Next slide. And so because of this limited site-specific data for the Gulf, stakeholders identified NOAA's Marine Life Data Analysis Team models, or MDAT models, as the most comprehensive for our use in our area of interest. Stakeholders realized that the MDAT models would be useful for things like identifying spatial and temporal use patterns, or providing species relative abundance, or providing distribution of some species region-wide, and also identified some seasonal changes within the region. So stakeholders immediately realized there would be some shortfalls, however, of these MDAT models, and primarily the MDAT models cover the entire East Coast from Maine all the way down to Florida. So as a result, there's just some models and species that aren't applicable to Maine waters. And one of the other issues too they found is that the information for the research array area of interest is too coarse scale for our use. So next slide, and with that as an introduction, I'm going to hand the remainder over to Wing from Biodiversity Research Institute. He's the one who conducted the actual MDAT model analyses. Take it, Wing.
Hey, thanks, John. So yes, I'm Wing Goodale. I'm the Senior Science Director at Biodiversity Research Institute. And what we did is we took the MDAT models that John just walked us through and asked the question on, can we use those models to understand the lower relative use for species that are vulnerable to, on a population level, vulnerable to collision and displacement. And so we did so, we created 3 maps depicting a spatial avian risk for 36 species likely to be present in the research array. So those MDAT models have about 47 species in it, but we obviously cut out species that were not applicable to the Gulf of Maine. Excuse me. So in doing this, we created the scoring process for vulnerability. So when we looked at population, we combined a variety of factors, including overall population status from partners in flight, state status, adult survivorship, a regional population score. And so we want to look at, is the area of interest in a relative higher or lower use for each individual species, and then combine that into a single population vulnerability score. And we did something similar for collision vulnerability, where we combine information on time in the rotor swept zone, which we got from the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog. Those based on surveys, avoidance rates, we know from the literature, and then flight activity. So is a species more or less likely to be flying in the air and vulnerable to collision? And then finally, we looked at displacement. And I should just mention that collision and displacement are the 2 sort of key risk factors that we want to look at. And then for displacement, we focused in again on avoidance, so macro avoidance. So are birds more or less likely to avoid entire wind farms? And then also considered habitat flexibility. Really asking the question, is a species more likely to be a generalist or a specialist, where the loss of a particular area may have lower or higher relative loss of habitat for them? So we created the scoring, and then what we did is we weighed the MDAT models by the results of these scoring for each of these categories. And now I'll show you those results. Next slide, please. So one thing you'll see right off the bat here is a really nice synergy with what Carl just presented. And it's quite interesting to see. So we did our analysis independently, of course, of what Carl did with a different process, and came up with really quite similar results. So areas in blue and green are lower relative use for, in this case, for species that have population vulnerability, and areas in yellow in the reddish are areas with higher relative use. And one thing as you look at these maps, just remember the scale of these models, and that, so I wouldn't, any particular pixel as it transitions from one color to another, that may or may not be accurate. But if you look at sort of the overall trends, it helps guide us to areas of relative lower or higher use for this particular weighted model. Next slide, please.
Wayne, could you go through the colors one more time? I think they kind of flip from what Carl's were. So just so we're really clear about what color means what.
Oh, sure. So blue is the lowest. So blue is low. That greenish, the number 2 there, you can see the scale on the left. That's going to be sort of, so you think about blue as minimal, green as low, and yellow as moderate, and red is higher. And this is relative, importantly, within this area, not for like the whole Gulf of Maine. So again, like Carl's presentation, this is for this area of interest only. Next slide, please. So this map will look very similar to the last. So it's a very similar type result for species vulnerable to displacement risk. And we see really, again, the same sort of pattern across this area. And just be note that areas like Platt's Bank are important, particularly some of the species that have displacement risk are diving sea ducks. And so access to the seafloor is going to be important for them. So shallower, more productive areas are going to be areas that there are a species group that might be accessing that area. Next slide, please. So this is the final map, and here we are looking at collision vulnerability. We see the area hone in a little bit further, but again, we're seeing the same relative trend throughout, because in each of these cases, this is the same aggregated MDAT models of density for 36 species of seabirds that we're seeing here together. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that within this area, there is a lack of data within the Gulf of Maine at a fine scale. So it does make it difficult to draw specific conclusions, particularly for rare species. So there are areas to the south of us, south of the Gulf of Maine, that have benefited from substantially large surveys. So we don't have that kind of data available, but these MDAT models are the best available data that we have. And these results suggest lower potential relative use of marine birds around the deeper waters of the sort of broader area of mistaken ground. And the reason for that is, probably based on three different things. One is distance from shore, water depth, and lack of significant underwater features. And just a note about the MDAT models, so you know what's sort of going in behind those. Those were built from survey data collected from 1978 or so to 2017 for the most recent models. And all that survey data up and down the East Coast was related to environmental predictor variables like distance from shore and water depth. So looking at relationships on the between marine birds and these factors. So it is not a surprise that we see some of these influencing the outcome here. Next slide, please. So overall, if we've seen the DMR's narrowed area of interest overlaps with the portions of blue and green areas in the analysis that we conducted, and indicates lower relative use for marine birds. And, for terrestrial species, it's sort of broadly a data gap on how terrestrial species are migrating over the Gulf of Maine. But sort of some general ideas is that the further you get from shore, you're going to have lower relative use by overall by terrestrial birds, and that those that are flying across the Gulf, and there are certainly large groups that do, that they are probably flying higher the further you get from shore. And again, just to sort of reiterate some things that Carl said about fishing use, this does not mean that there is no use by marine birds in this area. It just means that it's relatively lower use compared to the areas around it. Because marine mammals are likely keying on similar environmental characteristics as marine birds, these MDAT models really are providing some useful comprehensive information to help inform siting and minimize impacts generally overall to wildlife. And so with that, I'll hand it back.
Great, Wayne, thank you. And I know you guys did a lot of work, and these are short slides to cover a lot of detailed work everyone did here. So there's a question from Jim Kendall that might go, I'm not sure whether it goes back to Carl or to maybe Selena or Meredith, it says, has there been or will there be bottom surveys done within the area of interest, similar to what SMAST has done with their camera survey in the Massachusetts wind area?
Yeah, there's a long list of surveys that would like to be done, we did get very detailed hydrographic or bathymetric maps for all but the lower third of that narrowed area of interest as well. So there's additional multi-beam mapping that needs to be done as well.
Great. Kenneth Capron, there's a question for you in chat. I might want to have you just verbalize that if you want to just open your mic and speak to that. So Ken, I don't know if you want to talk about your question you just put in chat.
Well, if you remember, the Mopa dace was the little fish in Nevada that blocked all that development. And there's only about 500 of them in the world, but it became such a rare species that it basically shut down a big project. I'm just wondering if there's something out there that, I don't know how well we've explored the Gulf, but I'd be careful about, excluding things that we haven't looked at yet.
Okay, appreciate it. Very helpful. Other questions for Wing or for John on the wildlife work that was done? Again, generally in this particular case, finding there's a overlap between greater and lesser intensity of fisheries, birds, and likely marine mammals as well. Not non-existent, but less intensity is noted. Okay. I think what we want to do is we want to move into really then kind of what for lack of better terms, I'll call the micro-siting within the narrowed area of interest. And Selena's going to give us some information about how the state's thinking about that. And then this next piece, we really do want some conversation about if people like or don't like what Selena's suggesting within the narrowed area of interest. If you have different suggestions for how the kind of array might be cited within that, please chime in, express your rationale or interest. Would be very helpful this time as we're continuing to kind of hone in, but still gathering comment, particularly on this citing within the narrative interest. So Selena, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks. And Cameron, if you could go to the next slide. There's not one in between because we're going there. Can you go back one? Well, I guess I'll just say that there we go.
Okay, there we go.
So what the governor's energy office did is we've started with this large area of interest with hundreds of square miles. DMR provided the information on the narrowed area, and the work on the wildlife side aligned with it. So GEO has determined to move forward with citing the array within this area that has been identified as not avoiding all impacts, but minimizing impacts within the area of interest. And given from the beginning, our emphasis on reducing impacts to those in those two areas in particular, in terms of fishing and wildlife, we felt comfortable with moving forward with identifying a preferred site for 16 square miles within this narrowed area. There's two points I just want to make briefly. One is that we made minor modifications to the shape that DMR used for two reasons. Number one is that DMR used a 1 nautical mile grid. BOEM and their leasing grid is a little bit different. It's a different, it's 3 mile by 3 mile BOEM leasing structure. So we aligned it with BOEM's process to make sure that we had the right shape for the narrowed area. And then we made a couple modifications to allow for the shape of the configuration that I'll go into in a minute. And so that change we're now still calling it the narrowed area of interest, but the change as it's a 55.5 square mile area or 35,500 acres. So it's very similar, but just wanted to provide that clarification. The other thing is that we will cite the final research array for the purposes of application in this area based on our commitment to do that. The line, we think of it as more as a fuzzy line in terms of a hard line. If there's some information that we get that's a 1/4 of an inch this way or that way, we're willing to make that accommodation, but generally working in this area here. And so with that, I think we can, unless there are any questions, move into the next slides.
Thanks, Lena. Okay, Cameron, let's forward those if we could.
So early on, we shared some information about possible configuration of for the purposes of the lease. What I'll say is that we know that there'll be up to 12 turbines. It's quite possible that there are less than 12. As when we started this process, we had anticipated that they'd be 10 to 14 megawatt sized turbines. Given the rapid growth of the industry, even in the last several months that we've been talking, it's likely more in the 12 to 15 megawatt range. Earlier, I mentioned LD 336, which is the power purchase agreement authorization that's capped at 144 megawatts. So we'll have to make sure that this project will not exceed 144 megawatts. Therefore, there may be less than 12 turbines. That decision will be made at a later date. Through our conversations with people, we didn't get a lot of feedback in terms of the ideal configuration. So what we wanted to pursue is, given that we still have some uncertainty around the around the exact kind of bathymetry of the area and the number of turbines, that we want to provide flexibility in the lease outline to make future decisions around the configuration later on. So if you go to the next slide. What we'll pursue in the application to BOEM is the shape on the right-hand side, which allows for various configurations to review various configurations. We'll only build one configuration finally, but we want to make sure that we provide flexibility at this point to microsite later on. As you saw earlier, we want to hopefully look at potential for transit lanes and work with ocean users to make sure that we put those in the right place and think about the best way to configure the final site with uses in mind and also from a research perspective. Next slide. So when we had the narrowed area of interest that we identified based on the emphasis on wildlife and fishing, we then looked at the various other factors, including bathymetry, navigation, defense, and cost. And if you go to the next slide. And GEO is putting forward a preferred site in this area here. And what I want to emphasize is that we have put this map out here. We want to get feedback on it today. We have a comment period through the end of the month because as Carl mentioned, we do want more conversations with people who are actually out there fishing to understand how it makes sense where it makes sense to site this. This is our preferred option, open to making adjustment to that based on the feedback we get. And ultimately, it's a matter of balancing the trade-offs that we know that there are impacts. We want to try to minimize that, but it is a balancing factor that we'll work through. So I think that's the last slide, but happy to.
Selena, do you have one more with a narrower, more of the fathom lines in the, I don't know if we have them or not.
Yep.
There we go, perfect, awesome. So I think Jack Merrill, I missed your hand up before, I apologize. So Jack, let me go to you first, and then we'll go to other comments or questions on this kind of narrowed interest in the proposal or idea that Selena's put forward. So Jack, over to you.
Hello.
Hey, Jack, sorry about that.
Hey, no, actually, a lot of stuff is has so many things to comment on, but I just want to make a general statement and then ask a question. The ecosystem impacts are what really concern me. Obviously, I'm concerned as a fisherman too, but I've heard stories from Europe about these arrays changing wind patterns, changing tide patterns, and affecting the ecosystem. And that to me is the most dangerous part of this whole process. And I know this is a test array, but we also know what some companies would like to do offshore. To me, it's really scary. And if Massachusetts and rest of New England want to do it, they can go for it, but I don't want to industrialize our ocean. We've already hurt the planet with fossil fuel use on land, and let's leave the ocean alone. But anyway, my question is, has anyone, how much research has been done about actually what has happened in Europe? Because they have a 10 to 15 year history in a lot of places. My information tells me that it's all pretty negative right now. And that's why the European companies are over here looking to invest here, because that investment has gone bad as soon as the government hasn't been paying subsidies. It's become pretty clear that it's not affordable. But anyway, that's my question. Have you guys looked a lot at Europe? And if so, if not, can you do that? Because I think that would be a valuable part of the whole thing.
Through our effort, we have wanted to engage and to work with the people who have more experience with this, be it in various European countries and elsewhere. We have a MOU with the United Kingdom to try to exchange information with them. The history is primarily in fixed bottom. There are some floating projects, but those they're not that many. And so you're right that there is, I think probably both from a positive and negative changing ecosystem impact from fixed bottom platforms. we want to make sure that we learn more about floating platforms, and that's why we're pursuing this here. I don't know if DMR has anything else to add specifically on the research side, but just wanted to point out that we do recognize the need to engage with European partners and others to share and build on their research.
DMR, anything else on that? If I move to Terry.
No, I mean, we're, I'd say we're drinking from a fire hose of information. I mean, this is, a relatively new field for our department to take on. And, we've tried to do the best we can with as far as the citing of this document. But I think there's still a lot to be learned around wind.
Terry, you're up next.
Well, Carl,
Sure.
can I just say, one of the things that I've run across is that in the UK, for example, the sand lance population, which sand lance, I believe, is similar to our herring in a way. It's kind of an in-between species that both birds and fish depend on. And the paper that I saw said there was a 50% decline around the areas these windmills are in. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think from an ecological or ecosystem perspective, Jack, I think that it's very interesting that there's kind of a convergence of thought across the wildlife fields and the fisheries and marine resource fields that lead us to this area. I think that's very interesting because, again, question 1A is what's the impact on the resources. And so if this area has relatively maybe a lower diversity or kind of a lower holding power for diversity of fisheries, a diversity of organisms, diversity of wildlife, then, and you introduce structures, then we want to understand what that impact might be. Yep.
thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for waiting too. Terry, Nicholas, I have a comment from David Bean too about marine mammals. I'll get to in a second. So Terry, over to you.
Yeah, so quick question for Selena. The layout that you had, the 3 or 4 different layouts there that you had up on the screen, is that going by Coast Guard's recommendation for transit lanes? Or is the state thinking that we're going to be able to transit those areas, or are those going to be off limits to both transiting, or better yet, I mean, there's plenty of fixed gear fisheries that could probably fish inside that wind array. Are they going to allow that?
So the image that you saw was approximately a mile between the 2 dots, the turbines, and 2 miles in the transit area. I think the intent is to allow for fishing and navigation, although we'd want to work with the Coast Guard to make sure that we're meeting those standards, and also the question of whether people felt comfortable fishing in those areas. So it depends on what type of gear and the ultimate design. So I think, yes, that that's the goal in terms of having transit lanes. And I think that'll help inform when you think about larger projects in the Gulf of Maine. We want some experience to learn what is the best way to configure them as well. So that's the intent there, that we would pursue with stakeholders prior to making a final configuration decision later on in the development of this process.
Can I follow up on that?
And Terry, you can. And then I noticed Michelle from the Coast Guard's on, so I might even ask her to if she's willing just to talk about the current Coast Guard policy is on fishing or transit in arrays. But Terry, go ahead first, and then I'll turn to Michelle.
Yeah. So is the state, the energy office, going to require the developers to let, if people want to fish in those areas, to fish in those areas? Is I know the intent is there, but
in my conversations, that the developer has been completely committed to that. I think we'd want to make sure from a safety standpoint that we are abiding by safety needs. Other than that, I mean, I think, yes, absolutely.
Michelle, I'm calling you on the spot, but I noticed you were on the call. If you're willing, just from the Coast Guard's perspective, broadly, not specific to this area, but broadly on the inland coast, what the policy's been in terms of fishing or transit within wind arrays to date.
Hey, how are we doing, Pat? So the Coast Guard this is not a regulatory regime. So transit lanes are just things that have been discussed, and there is no restriction on whether somebody could fish or transit at the same time. So there's going to be no restriction from a Coast Guard perspective. And this is the first time that we've seen the potential array layout. So we'll definitely be looking at this from a Coast Guard and navigation perspective.
Great, Michelle, thank you. Really appreciate it. Okay, Nicholas, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I have 2 questions. So you talked about the preferred AOI. Is that what you intend to submit in the application for that particular site, or is there a chance you'll still refine that further before you actually submit the application? And then my second question involves the micro sighting that Sam just talked about. My understanding is that the benthic area hasn't been completely mapped yet. With the microsighting, is your intention to avoid hard bottom areas of the site, sort of in the soft, muddier bottom areas?
Sure. So in terms of the preferred site, no, this is our preferred site. We were going out for feedback prior to finalizing that. We'll review the feedback, the conversations that we have, and then make a final decision for the purposes of the BOEM application. I just want to reiterate that this is a very beginning of the step. BOEM will go through a separate process to fully review the site. We want to provide the best available information to help inform their process, and they'll make a leasing determination on that. Your question about the bottom, that we do know that there is some outcropping here on the far left, it's kind of southwest area there. That is, we do believe is rocky. We from my conversations with the developer, any kind of bottom is workable from an anchoring perspective, although it's preferred to avoid it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nicholas. There's a question from David Bean. Migration routes of marine mammals would overlap with the AOI and could lead to a potential entanglement risk. Have you considered copepod abundance parameters and habitat suitability to predict behavior and movement patterns of right whales in the area of interest, such as Ross et al. 2021? So I don't know whether that's best for Wing or for Carl regarding migration routes and copepod abundance.
Yeah, I mean, I can take a quick stab at it. I mean, we were using the MDAT data for marine mammals, kind of with our characterization of activity, and as well as the sighting access through Large Whale Consortium. So if this was an area that was, kind of holding whales or, provided sufficient copepod densities or so, I would assume that would have come out in the other applications of marine mammals. I mean, just to the south, several miles below this or the narrowed area and the larger area of interest is a proposed right whale closure that is based on right whale sightings. We did not, especially in this narrowed area, we did not find much evidence of kind of that consistent holding of marine mammals that you would have found over on Platts Bank. Again, I'm not a marine mammal expert, so just playing one on the webinar tonight.
Okay. All right, great. I want to note that Jim Kindle put an earlier comment in. I think he was interested in potentially future research, Carl, around using cameras like they did, I think, in the Massachusetts area.
Yeah, and I responded to him directly, but there's several applications where direct observations would be very helpful. Just as far as research questions and characterization, whether it be the habitat or how the anchoring system might be interacting with the bottom, what fish may or may not be aggregating around the structure, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think there's plenty of applications to correct at least digital eyeballs on what's going on.
Okay, great. And Aaron had a comment just about a study about fixed bottom that URI was doing, recognizing that that's fixed bottom, turbines, not the floating, which again, we don't know as much because it's a pretty new technology, even in Europe. I see Jocelyn has a comment, so we'll go to Jocelyn next.
Thanks. I have a process question. I really appreciate all the work and effort being done in trying to find the optimal siting for this research array. So I guess my question is, during the BOEM process, is there a potential that the lease site could change after all of this work has been done? Just wanted to get clarity on what that process might look like as more feedback starts to come in the bigger process.
So BOEM, when BOEM receives the, excuse me, the application, they will issue public notice and take feedback on it, and then go through a NEPA analysis and make a final determination on the lease request. I don't know of or believe of any, what will come of a modification to the lease site, but it is not a state decision. It is a federal leasing decision. So no reason to believe they would move, but they need to do the thorough analysis and make a decision on the lease.
I think one thing, two things. One is Laura put in chat, again, how you can comment up to the 30th. So, people are just seeing this in some case for the first time or only saw it yesterday. But as you think about kind of the preferred site area, and if you have thoughts about how it should be different within this narrowed array or narrowed area, please do submit comments, your rationale why. The state wants your comment about kind of this final siting question. So please do that. I did notice there was, yep.
There's also a summary document of all this information there as well, which might be useful for people to know they can reference.
And Laura, people have been asking about the recording for tonight, so that will be available as soon as we get it downloaded in the next day or two. Is that correct?
Yeah, in the next day or two, certainly by the end of the week. There are a couple other technical things going on, but yes, and there's a YouTube channel that Geo has, and the recording, starting a little bit late, sorry folks, will be online.
Right, good. And I noted David comment in the chat, which it is true, these are floating versus fixed. So some of the questions about transit or fishing within, but given that there's different kind of cabling and the like in a essentially a floating technology versus a fixed technology, raises good questions that I think the Coast Guard and others will certainly be looking at. So it raises a fair point. We are going to go to a second and kind of just discussing kind of where we're at with the research that this array will actually be seeking to try to undertake. Again, it's somewhat the beginning then, but we want to cover that. But I want to see if there's any other questions or comments around this kind of preferred site right now as suggested by the state. There is one question from Matt Gilley, maybe for you, about how much does it cost to lease the 16 square mile area, who pays for it and who gets paid, and how long does a lease last?
The lease is, so the state will submit the application and hold the lease. There is no lease fee associated with the lease. The lease length is not set in regulation. It'll be determined through what BOEM final decision on BOEM's front. The power purchase agreement will have a time set. I'm sorry, I can't quite remember what was in LD 336. I think it was in the range of 20 years or so for the operating agreement. I'm sorry, for the power purchase agreement for the project. At that point, one of the requirements for the federal lease is also decommissioning. So at the end of the life of the project, to return the site back to its, remove any equipment and return it back to original, how it was originally, to the extent that it can be, is part of the requirement.
There's a question from Scott, which is recognizing that you're not there yet, but what's the projected timeline for determining the preferred interconnection location, whether that be Wiscasset or closer to Portland?
Sure, and I see that Matt asked a question too that I'll just answer. So the BOEM regulations are specific related to research, related to for state or federal agencies to pursue research related to the research of energy production and transmission and transportation. So if any people who qualify for that can pursue the lease there. And then in terms of the question around interconnection, you asked about the process there.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's just about, do you have any sense of the timing for how once the application's in, where does kind of the transmission line siting and the location of where it will land onshore, when does that get decided? Maybe a little bit about how.
Sure, we don't have a specific date. I'd say in the next year or couple of years. What we need to do is both understand from an onshore perspective what's possible from a transmission perspective, understand that the site's a little bit more, and then also have more understanding of the survey work that would need to be taken. So I know that there is a lot of interest in the cable conversation, both the route and in the interconnection point, and we want to make sure that we provide real clarity and transparency into how and when, and allow opportunity for feedback before we get to a final decision.
There is another question in chat, and then I see Lewis, and then Jack will go to you, and then maybe we'll move next and to just discuss the research. So the question is just in terms of insurance and bonding and the like, Selena. I don't know whether the state law had certain bonding requirements for this project, or you will require them, or BUM requires them for bonding, insurance, you know, kind of those classic fiscal protections.
This part of this project is a joint partnership with the New England Aquaventus, which is a joint partnership between RWE Renewables and Diamond Offshore Wind. And the state will pursue the lease if there are financial obligations for the issuance of the lease, that the state will work with the developer to make sure that we meet those financial commitments for holding the lease in the project.
Right. I've got Lewis, you're up next, then Jack, and then we'll move on to the research. So Lewis, over to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, just a couple points that I want to bring up here that go in regards to what Jack Merrill had pointed out about whether you were in any kind of contact with the overseas wind farms and things like that. From the responses I heard, that you're trying to get this information, but you haven't gotten any information. I guess that would be more towards Carl Wilson than anybody, but well, I guess it would apply to a lot of things. It seems to me that we're micro-analyzing a lot of questions here, like, you know, what's it going to cost? Who's going to be bonded? What species are going to be affected? And it seems to me, generally, from a general tone here, that there's a lot of holes in the data that's being put forth. And if you have a lot of holes, how can you move forward already? She had talked about moving forward to refine the POI to a preferred site when you admittedly don't have the data. And I guess along with what Jack had said, there are places out there that have these farms up that are, according to one person or maybe two, affecting the environment. So how can we go this far with as little data as we have? That's my major question. And then the other point that I would bring out is, and I've been doing a lot of research with a lot of physicists and whatnot. If you have these wind farms already available and not working, fiscally speaking, not working, why, in the name of all that is holy, are we moving forward? I mean, you talk to anybody in the United Kingdom that has these things, there's problems with the infrastructure alone, let alone the cost, and then the cost to the actual consumer. So it's more of a rant than anything, but the first question, Lee, is still there. How can you move to a preferred site when you don't have the data available?
Turn that over to Selena. I'll take the next question and we'll move on. So.
I'm happy to take a stab too.
Sure, go ahead, Carl.
Yeah. Hi, Lewis. Good to see you again. I would say that there's kind of a growing collegial interactions with our colleagues across the pond and trying to learn from their experiences. And, you know, as somebody who, you know, is kind of new to the wind game, I think it's, you really use kind of these studies in other areas as a context. They provide context to the questions that you might ask and some of the experiences that other areas are having and how that might reflect into our area. Europe is not going to help us with our data gaps in the narrowed area of interest off of Platts Bank. You know, that's our job, and we need to fill those holes if this moves forward. You know, and we hope that we've gained some knowledge over the last 6 months, but there's certainly a lot more to go.
Thanks. I want to go, Jack, over to you, I think, for a final question before we go to the research review. Jack, you there? He was just there. I saw him a minute ago.
Am I there now?
There you go. There you are. Welcome back.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. My question is for the Coast Guard representative. I think she alluded to maybe a track of some kind that they might be interested in putting in, like we have for cruise ships here. I live in the Bar Harbor area. So my question is first, if that's true or not. The track that we have is a mile wide here for cruise ships, and it definitely restricts lobstering. No one fishes inside that mile wide swath that extends for, I don't know, 30, 40 miles. So it's quite an area of the bottom. But anyway, I'm just curious if that is being talked about.
Michelle, you wanted to give that a quick shot?
Hey, Pat, I just want to make sure I understand the question. When you mean by track, can you describe that? Is that a regulatory regime that you already see on the chart?
Yes, it's on the chart. Absolutely. And the cruise ships, it took years to get them to go by it, but they pretty much, they stay within those tracks. My concern, of course, is if there isn't a track, you've got these large vessels that are going to be making multiple trips, possibly in fog and different conditions. There's going to be a heck of a lot more traffic out there, and big boat traffic. And the other thing that I've heard, I can't say that it's been confirmed, but I've heard it, is that these arrays can affect radar. And I wonder if the Coast Guard has looked into that and addressed that situation, because if you don't have radar and you've got large ships operating, you've got a real problem.
Pat, you want me to follow up on that?
If you don't mind, that'd be
Okay.
great. Thank you for
Yes. So one of the things, and I don't want to take away from the state of Maine's focus that this is the fishing and wildlife webinar. Maybe it's possible we could have a specific webinar talking with stakeholders about navigation. But I think that your question is spot on, and we are, just like we're working on things with the New York Bight and the Massachusetts Rhode Island area, we are looking at the Gulf of Maine and to understand what some of the navigation concerns are, and potentially looking at regulatory options like you were discussing, fairways that would provide safe access to and from the ports within the Gulf of Maine. So that's an ongoing process that we're working on, and definitely as the state of Maine works through this process, we'll be continuing that information exchange.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And Jack, on radar interference, that is definitely a open question some people have raised. So I think that's probably not a conversation we can solve today, but it's certainly an issue people have raised. And I know other parts of the coast, people have been talking about that as a potential issue as well. So great. Thank you all for the good questions. We want to kind of really, the last part of our agenda before next step is to talk a little bit about the research and how and way that's going to proceed, because obviously this is a research array. So I'm going to turn this over to Selena and talk about that next step for this project as well.
Great. You'd go to the next slide, Cameron. So this is a slide many may have seen before. We have identified that research is the key driver for the array, and that we are considering research in all aspects of our kind of process associated with the project. And we started with some initial key themes we put forward. Next slide. So what we've done since then is gather input and feedback through our 4 work sessions, through conversations with agencies, stakeholder one-on-one conversations, and expert and feedback with and discussion with scientific experts. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the hard work that both DMR, IFNW, as well as Damian Brady, University of Maine, and others in the university, and Wayne Goodall and Biodiversity Institute helped us in doing some of this work. What we are going to do for the purposes of the research of the application to BOEM is include a research framework, which is a broad umbrella that captures the scope of the questions and the areas of focus that may be explored, and will pursue and include a number of objectives that are similar to what we've talked about through all of this process. So go to the next slide, please. The research framework is broken into 3 categories to kind of try to organize the types of focus that are possible in the research array. And those are the human dimension, ecosystem and environment, and technology development. And the it's a Venn diagram because there's overlap between each one of those in various ways, and the research will undoubtedly overlap, but we do want to make sure that we focus on all three elements. The research framework will ultimately include examples, and we're going to go into some in a minute, of the types of questions. The document does not, and the BOEM application does not make any decisions about the specific research that will take place at the research array. We've been talking, there have been some questions around monitoring, and there is a certain amount of monitoring that is required for permitting purposes and for designing the project. From a research standpoint, we want to look above and beyond that in terms of what is needed, and we understand and heard through their stakeholder conversations the urgency of starting that monitoring work as soon as possible. And so we'll certainly look at how to pivot to that as soon as we can. We'll need, in addition to the $3 million that we have from the state, we'll need additional money to fund the concepts that we'll talk about during this section. Next slide. So I'll start with the human dimension. I'll turn to DMR next to talk about fisheries and socioeconomic impact. So I'll skip that just to say that we'll also want to look at navigation and supply chain and workforce that are kind of the human components. And we've talked a little bit about the need to understand from a navigation perspective how the research array and offshore wind projects affect navigation, and how do the additional maintenance vessels that are offshore interact with other vessels within that area, and how to minimize any congestion areas. On the supply chain and workforce side, looking at in Maine what existing industries, businesses can transition into the offshore wind supply chain, and particularly focusing on floating offshore wind, and then what job skills and training programs are needed to have the workforce necessary to construct and to operate and maintain these projects. And then I'll turn it over to DMR for the next slide.
Hi, everyone. I'm Meredith Mendelson. I'm with the Department of Marine Resources. Good to see you all tonight. So just to give you some examples, as Selena said, of some of the questions related to fisheries, some of the key ones that we've talked about and certainly heard a lot in our conversations with fishermen about this project is concern around the mooring lines, how they will be laying on the bottom, and how and if they'll become buried over time, and what that might mean for how both mobile or fixed gear operations can operate within the array, either between turbines or even in transit lanes where there is perhaps more space between the mooring systems. We've certainly heard people asking questions about effort displacement and what that might mean for their own operations outside of the area if they don't operate inside the area. So will landings be impacted both inside the area as well as around it? Thinking more about gear issues, if fishing gear does become entangled in the mooring system, that could present different hazards for other species, including whales. So how can we work on detecting any gear entangled in the mooring systems and ensure that it's removed safely and efficiently? From a socioeconomic standpoint, there are many questions that we can explore here. How does the research array directly and indirectly impact employment activities? What type of jobs are impacted? And then does the research array have specific types of effects on opportunities related to fishing, including shoreside infrastructure or coastal communities? We need to certainly understand what those socioeconomic impacts might be. So again, just examples of some of the things that we're discussing and considering, and we'll be discussing further as this work proceeds.
And I'll turn it over to John Perry to talk about ecosystem and environment.
Actually, I'll be handing that off to Wing, Selena.
Okay.
Yeah, so when we think about the research array, we've discussed areas of uncertainty, and that's one area when we think about the research array, how can we reduce that uncertainty? And I would say that there are sort of three broad categories to consider. One are series of questions around species occurrence and how can that change and how does that change through time? And I really think about these as the question of like who's, where, when. For some of the species such as migratory songbirds and bats, they're really hard to study without structures offshore. And so you're able to start to work on some of those types of questions with the when there is structure offshore. There's another set of questions around what are the particular stressors that are caused specifically by floating offshore wind. How does the ecosystem and wildlife specifically respond to those? And then what can be done to minimize those particular stressors? And then finally, there's a set of broad questions that are really integrated questions in which we consider how the ecosystem, was already discussed, may change around the turbines and how is the below and above water responding to those changes. Next slide, please. So within those categories here of some example questions on occurrence, do cetaceans avoid or swim through the research array? Are bats present at the array? And how does use relate to weather and time of year? How do fish and wildlife distributions and abundance change? And then when we think about the ecosystem side, this is where questions such as, are there surface current changes that impact larval and plankton communities due to these structures? And are marine birds attracted to turbines because of increased foraging opportunities? And then if we think about the turbines, the research array as a whole, we can ask questions around how does the array change baseline noise levels? And if so, what are the potential effects to marine species? Are whales at risk of secondary entanglement with derelict fishing gear caught on array cables? Does EMF of dynamic or buried cables alter the behavior of benthic resources? And these are just examples of really hundreds of questions that have been raised during some of these meetings that we've had. And these will be further refined through further conversation. I'll pass it back.
Thanks. And then Chris Wisseman with Diamond Offshore Wind will touch on technology next.
Great, thanks, Selena, and thanks everybody. So I'm an engineer, so I wanted to wrestle down some charts and figures. So first of all, if you look at the figure of the person next to two figures, one is on the right of that is one chain link. So when we talk about chain, this is not the chain that you moor your boat with. This is really heavy duty. Each link could be 300 pounds or so. Next to it is what we call the synthetic potential mooring line. So a big part of the research is, and this is also both to mitigate impact on fisheries, but also to reduce cost. So we're totally aligned there. Is the figure in the upper right is looking down on an individual wind farm. And so with chain, that is what we call catenary. It's kind of hanging in the water column. The span could be somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 feet, potentially depending on where the anchor lands. Is it landing? Do we have to move it to find mud or something like that? And if you see the arrow, it would be showing if we go to a hybrid, and that is having a long segment in the middle that is hybrid, actually the footprint shrinks quite a bit. So I think everybody is interested in that, shrinking the footprint, allow more fishing. So that is one of the major areas. And some of the things that we are going to have to deal with is, since we don't know exactly meter by meter where there might be bedrock, part of it would be moving where the anchors are located to avoid the bedrock. But if unavoidable, we might have to come up with some way to sort of drill into the bedrock and put an anchor right in the middle of that. Huge part of the research. I think to Meredith's point, if you look in the figure on the bottom, This shows, if you could imagine during normal operations, you see the cable largely going, more or less straight down from the foundation to the seabed, and then it's laying on the seabed and partially buried for a great length of it, except during gales and during, if you can imagine the wind blowing in from the right there, some portion of that cable is going to become lifted up as the foundation moves a little bit. And during a really extreme gale, a large portion of it will be lifted up. And so the question really is, if you can see, some portions of that really might be buried for the entire life of the wind farm. We need to come up with ways to be able to communicate efficiently to fisheries to let you know, hey, look, it's okay to fish over that. This cable's been sitting there for a decade. It has not moved. If you look at the third bullet there, we start to get into how we build a wind farm. One of the things that we really want to look at is what apparatus can be used to launch these foundations. These are big, these are very heavy, and it's kind of the equivalent of launching a ship. And so what we want to make sure is that if a port is built out to accommodate this, it really accommodates it in a way that can allow multiple uses and multiple different types of foundations. And then one of the really big parts here is embodied in that last bullet that's worthy of an entire discussion by itself, but is really, how do we design, come up with fabrication methods, manufacturing methods to prove that this can really be built entirely in Maine, creating jobs for Mainers, because we don't want offshore wind to be something that is really all imported. We want to make sure that it is built here. So a big part of this is just working through all the mechanics of figuring out actually how to build it in Maine. Now, there's a litany of other smaller things. I just wanted to get some of the high points. Thanks, Elena.
Thanks, Chris. Next slide, please. So in terms of process, we will finalize a research framework that outlines these areas of focus for the purposes of the BOEM application. We will, we already talked about monitoring and our need to work on a plan for that. We'll stand up the legislative directed research consortium I covered earlier, and then over the longer term, develop a research plan and seek additional funding that includes federal and other sources to help augment and support this project. There's a lot more that we could discuss here, and we'll look forward to engaging with and want to engage on the research plan and other aspects with stakeholders to make sure that we are asking the fundamental questions that will help inform future projects.
Great. I think because of time, we have time for one question. So Ben, you're it. Go for it.
This is to the last bullet, so it's a pertinent question. So do you guys have a budget for what it's going to cost to do all of the different research projects that you've outlined through this, and then how are we funding it?
Yeah, so we do not have the process so far has been to seek as broad input as possible in terms of the types of questions. We want to make sure that we're also coordinating with existing bodies, be it the National Offshore Wind Research Consortium or ROSA, to not duplicate efforts, but build on other studies and efforts that are underway. We may not be able to accomplish everything that we're putting forward here, and need to really emphasize that we'll have to prioritize what are these key items that we want to pursue in the research plan and to seek funding to accomplish. The state has invested $3 million, which will help jumpstart that effort. But more funding will be needed to pursue this, and I think we were all dedicated to working to try to seek additional funding in order to accomplish these goals.
Great, thanks, Lena. Okay, only because we want to kind of finish on time. I know there are a few next steps that you wanted to share about kind of where to from here, both kind of comment over the next 2 weeks and then thereafter. So Selena, I kind of turn it over to you to kind of help people understand where we go from here.
Okay, next slide, Cameron. So we will, GEO, as we talked about, will consider public feedback that we receive through, we've set up an online form to receive feedback. I'll acknowledge that that may not be workable for all everyone involved. And so whether it be through DMR or I are happy to try to figure out if you aren't unable to use the form, how we can get your input and to help inform our decision before July 30th. So please be in touch if you have questions on that. I just put the question there that we're seeking input on the preferred site and any additional information about the narrow area of interest that we should consider when citing the final project for the application. And then we'll make a determination of a final site and submit an application this summer. Next slide. Okay, went over those and finalized the research framework. The application itself, just wanted to share briefly, includes the specific location of the square mile site, doesn't include location of turbines, just the outline of the lease. It'll provide a description of the project, the available site characteristics, the information that we're talking about here that we know about it, and then the research framework. Next slide. And over the longer term, BOEM will go through a separate process, including public notice and National Environmental Policy Act review with public comment. Over the next we're looking at years now, we'll be working on site-specific information to inform what's similar to a construction and operations plan. And we'll be working with a developer to design that project. There'll be a full NEPA review on that plan, including incidental take authorization and ESA consultation, and doing the surveys and permitting over in several years and opportunities for public input. Next slide. Next slide. And just very briefly in our last few minutes, tomorrow we are launching the first meeting of the Offshore Wind Roadmap Advisory Committee. There are a number of working groups focusing on different areas, and including a fisheries working group and an environmental and wildlife working group. We are specifically focusing on how to link the roadmap and the research array work. There are just a few examples here. I'm not going to read that through, but just an area that we are wanting to make sure that we take the information that we've learned, the experience that we've had through the research array, and carry it forward into our roadmap effort. Next slide. And I think you've all gotten that information, how to engage. And I just want to take a last minute to really acknowledge the time that people have spent in having conversations, especially about something that you don't necessarily always agree with and have concerns with. And I know that this work obviously we need to have a lot more conversations together, but really just want to take a minute to acknowledge the input and the continued participation that you've had throughout this process. And I'm very much appreciative of it.
All right. So I think, Selena, with that, we've covered our agenda for tonight. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So again, anybody who has comments again on overall as the state begins to close and finish its application, and or particularly kind of that particular site within the narrowed area of interest would be very, very helpful. Again, someone actually asked for a link to register for tomorrow's meeting, I think for the roadmap. Laura, can you put that link into the chat before we finish? Or Cameron, I think we have that. So we will, Erna, we'll try to put that in before we close. We'll leave it open a bit longer. Laura, anything else that we need to cover?
I think we covered it. I put a couple links into the chat in terms of where the recording will be and offshore wind at maine.gov. If you have further information or comments or want to get in touch with someone and the format of the form doesn't work for you. And I am looking up where I have the registration link.
Great,
if someone else has it before me, feel free.
Stephanie got it right in there. That was good.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Laura. Appreciate it, everybody. Thank you, Cameron, for the tech support, for all of your participation, for all the hard work that was done today. Thank you. Be well. And for some of you, we'll probably see you tomorrow morning. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.